Well, first of all, I would like to thank Michel Barnier for being kind enough to take a little bit of his precious time to be with us today, because I know that he's got a very busy agenda. I would like to thank him for every nice thing he said about the future of Europe. It's very constructive. I will go and see you in Brussels to see how these 20 ideas that you mentioned can really be implemented, and how we can work on this debate at the scale of Europe, and how we can create the conditions of a long-term world. Of course, the European project is a long-term project right from the beginning. Actually, you could start in the 16th century. People had this idea of a Europe that would be brought together, and now we know that it is possible. We also have lessons to draw from European institutions. Each of these institutions is just insufficient enough to create the need for the next one. You know, the common market, the single market, the euro, which creates the need for a federal Europe. And one of the ambiguities of the European project, there's the European Union and the eurozone, and they don't move at the same pace. And this is something that Michel Barnier sees every day, because banking union is a project of the eurozone. And there is this dynamic approach, which should be a model for the rest of the world. But where it's difficult for the world and for Europe, it's that every time there has been unity, there was a conqueror, somebody who takes power somewhere else. And for the second time in history, we are trying to have a unification project without a unifying person, without a conqueror. Well, the first time it happened, it was Switzerland, because they became unified. All the cantons, all the counties became unified. But if you look at the history of Switzerland, to go from their different states to their confederal state, as they have right now, which would be like Europe, and they reached that in the 19th century, but it took them 4 centuries. And we did in 50 years what the Swiss did in 4 centuries. And so we either have to move much faster or to be doomed to crumbling, as you've seen the Soviet federal system crumble, as you've seen the Yugoslavian federal system crumble, as you see that the Indian system is threatened. So if we try to take this at a broader scale, it's going to be even more difficult. How can you succeed at the world scale what we still haven't been able to do at the scale of Europe? So let's look at Europe as not only a project for Europe in itself, but also as a model for what should be done at the scale of the world. I'd like to ask you a question about that, Michel Barnier. The European project, as we've seen in our debates, can only make sense if it's designed and thought in the long term. And it's not the case today, not explicitly. Because we're afraid of words, I think. We are afraid to admit that the future of Europe will make no sense if it's not political, and that it can not be political with 28 members. It can only be political, let's say, in the eurozone, because these countries have a currency in common. So how do you think that, just in your area of competence, how can we take banking integration forward in the eurozone that will lead to political integration without generating anger and antagonizing from those who don't want to be part of it? Well, that's a very open question. Let me first pick up on 2 or 3 things that you've said. Nowhere in the world today, and never in history, I really like your comparison with Switzerland. I used to live in the Savoie region, in the east of France, very close to Switzerland, but of course it's a different scale. But never in history and nowhere else in the world such a political construction was started. At the scale of a continent, 500 million citizens, 28 nations, 24 languages, each with their own identity. And of course, we are attached to our identities and to our differences. You know, Jacques, I think in order to fight the nationalism that we see emerge a little bit everywhere, including in France, we need the nations. We need nations who put their destinies together. They don't merge. They don't erase the differences. They don't deny each other's identities. So what we've been doing for more than 60 years, and I'm very proud to be the heir of some of the great men who wanted this to happen. So what we've been doing is putting the nations together. Now, is this a model? Well, let's say it's an experience. When you're French or European, you're not supposed to lecture the others. So I'm being very careful about that. But I'm sure that other continents should also bring together their national destinies. Latin America, for one. Africa, maybe in sub-regions, West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and it's also the case for Asia. Even though in Asia, of course, they have huge countries that are perfectly well on their own. But in Europe, we have Germany, the largest country, could not stay on its own. And we've created what Germany called the critical mass, critical size. That's one point. Second point. Can we continue to build Europe for the citizens but without them? By only addressing governance, banking union, budget monitoring, austerity? I don't think so. Because these are necessary conditions, as I tried to say earlier, but I think that we need to see a little bit further. We need to talk about a different growth, a different model for development. We need to talk about foreign policy, we need to talk about security, we need to talk about defense, we need to talk about a political Europe. So these are the challenges which lie ahead of us right now. We're coming out of this crisis, and we are building these 4 pillars, which are so many lessons that we draw from our weaknesses, the 4 pillars that I mentioned earlier. They are basically lessons that we drew from our weaknesses and from the crisis of the past 5 years. So I was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was a great honor, and I did have the opportunity to view France as a country of the world, so that's a broader horizon. But we need to be European. We need to keep on with this project of mutualizing. That's the word I'm using because I think it's the best word. To mutualize, to put together those countries. I think that other regions in the world should also get organized like this, and then, as is already the case a little in the G20, you would have some global governance fora that would create a common framework for each of these regions to apply. What do I do when I do financial regulation, Jacques? I apply the decisions made by the G20 after the Lehman Brothers situation. And these regulations will apply to the whole of the market. Well, I'm not as enthusiastic as you are regarding the G20. For me, it's not a legitimate structure. It's not a decision-making structure because it's a very informal structure. While the IMF, the World Bank, and the Security Council of the UN have a legitimacy. I think it was a huge mistake to have the G20 and to have given the G20, i.e. the US, the power that should have lied in the hands of an institutional organization. For me, the G20 is the G empty because it's got no meaning. So I just would like to say that a global governance is not too difficult to create with the legitimacy. We would just have to merge the G20 and the UN Security Council. That is to put into the Security Council all the big powers which are in the G20 and which are not in the Security Council, and to have the IMF and the World Bank also under the authority of the Security Council. This can be done by a 4-line press release. The Security Council merges with the G20 and takes the lead over the IMF and the World Bank. We would have a real-world governance. We would have a potential for international action. Everybody knows that that's what we have to do, but it will probably not happen. And just like everybody knew before 1914 that we had to create the Society of Nations, it was not done at the time, it did not happen at the time. Everybody in 1929 knew that we had to do the European Union. The first projects date back from 1929. It did not happen. They knew that the Society of Nations had to be reformed, but every time they do it after the crisis happens and not before, and I'm afraid we're going to get there today. That's what's going to happen. Well, I think that the world governance bodies are under construction right now. I'm not talking about the UN Security Council. Well, you know, when I look at these crises that have happened since the past 5 years, I'm thinking that the G20, which actually got together for the first time for that crisis, under the impulse of France, Germany, and the UK at the time, was, I think, quite productive. It generated new rules to govern over the world finance, rules that did not exist before or that had been dismantled. So if you look at the efficiency of the Security Council, well, maybe you could compare the efficiency of the G20 and of the Security Council, and maybe it would not be to the advantage of the Security Council. What I see is that the G20 produced this. But I think this is not the end of the story. I think that what we call the Financial Stability Board, which depends on the G20 and which actually defines rules, this needs to be part of a more democratic system. And in this, you're right. I'm not opposed to this. I'm just saying that I'm not very enthusiastic or euphoric or anything about the G20, but I'm being very pragmatic, very practical. I'm seeing that the G20 made a certain number of very specific and very detailed decisions after this crisis when their backs against the walls in an emergency situation. And we are applying these rules, which create a new global governance for the financial markets. And luckily, because the US and Europe account for about 80% of the financial transactions today. 80% of all financial transactions are transatlantic between the US and Europe. And the US is actually doing the same thing. So, I see we don't have much time left. We have no time left, actually, even though we could discuss this for hours. Thank you very much, Michel Barnier, for joining us. And there's now the locavore market. Please go there and see how the people there can think global and produce locally. And thank you very much. And it's break time, it seems.